despite our challenges, we have emerged from the worst global economic downturn since the Great Depression with an economy that is, make no mistake, the envy of the entire world.
Stephen Harper today in his speech to party members, playing his party's ace card, the economy. But is it still an ace? That's the question tonight for The Bottom Line. Patty Croft is an economic analyst and former senior bank executive. Jim Stanford is an economist with Unifor, back from 6 months in Australia. We're glad you're back. Preet Banerjee is a freelance financial writer and broadcaster, and Amanda Lang, of course, is our senior business correspondent. Their thoughts in a moment, but first, some background. It's all about jobs, the politicians say, especially when they sniff an election just around the corner.
Jobs, 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 jobs.
So what's the jobs reality? There were new jobs last month, but not many, and they were overshadowed by losses, especially in the private sector. It cut almost 112,000 jobs, making it a year since the private sector was on the plus side of job creation. How about debt and deficits? No deficit in Ottawa this year. In fact, the government forecasts a surplus. On that, Canada stands alone in the G7. But on accumulated personal debt, the country's in rough shape, rougher than last year when dire warnings were issued about what big debt could mean. Right now, the average Canadian owes almost $21,000, and that doesn't count mortgages. Housing prices, they continue to defy logic. In fact, one U.S. credit agency says Canada's housing market is overvalued by 20%, which some feel is crash territory. Business. Even though it doesn't seem to be creating jobs, business sure is creating profits. The August rates are the highest in 3 years. So, what do all those numbers mean? What's working and what isn't? Are we still the world's economic champ, or could we be sliding towards chump status? Good questions. Let's try for some answers. Well, let's start with what you see as the most startling, surprising out of all those numbers, Patty.
To me, the most startling is the private sector job numbers, Peter. We saw that record drop, and over the past year, no growth in the private sector. And that just doesn't add up to me, because in the corporate sector, as you talked about, we've got record profits, companies are flush with cash, so something doesn't add up. But I think if we look back, Canada was really fast out of the gates after the Great Recession. We were the first economy to recover all the jobs lost, but since then, we've really stalled out with basically no growth since 2011, and that's got to be disconcerting for Canadians.
Jim, most startling.
No doubt the jobs numbers are the shocker, Peter. And it's not just the 1 month. As after all, you know, you never know. Statistics Canada might change the number on any 1 month.
They had a bad summer on
But
that.
it is the longer run trend that you're looking at. The one that really jumped out at me in the last 12 months, Canada as a whole, public and private sector, only created 15,000 full-time jobs. That's a drop in the bucket of what's required, and a very negative sign.
And it's worth remembering that on the jobs front, you know, we used to be ahead of the U.S. Just a couple of years ago. Now we're behind the U.S. Preet, you're most startling.
I actually have to echo Patty and Jim. Those job numbers are startling. So just to add some color to the conversation, if we look at all the jobs created over the last year, 80% of them were part-time. That's a trend that needs to be reversed.
Well, not to be a broken record here, I agree. The thing that I'm actually most interested in is it's a new number, but in that record decline in private sector jobs we saw in the last report, we also saw a record number of Canadians that now describe themselves as self-employed. And in that, I think there may be a story that we need to keep watching. It may be that there are some new types of jobs that are being captured in that, and that may be reason for optimism, I don't know. Or it may be that people don't want to say they're unemployed. They want to describe themselves that way. That's something to watch.
In terms of the big picture, not just jobs, some of the other things we mentioned and more, are we worse off or better off than we were a year ago? Patty?
I don't think we're worse off, Peter, but I think the average Canadian may not say they're a lot better off. However, I think it has a lot to do with where you live. So I think if you're a middle-class Canadian living in Alberta or parts of Saskatchewan or Newfoundland, life is pretty good. The rest of Canada, not so much. But there's a long list of things to worry about. We talked about debt. Are we saving enough? What about elder care, child care, affordable housing, and so on? And my sense is that of all those issues, over the past year, things have not gotten a lot better.
Worse off, better off? Preet?
I think there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. If we look at the second quarter, GDP growth was 3.1%. So 1% really is awful. 2%, you're still kind of nervous. 3%, things are pretty good. So it's whether or not it sustains. And I will say that the U.S. in the second quarter as well was over 4%. So that's positive development as well.
Jim?
It isn't so much that we're going backwards. It is just that we've kind of hit a wall. When the recession hit, Canada was relatively fast out of the gate. We had a couple of decent years when the governments were really emphasizing job creation, stimulus, trying to stop things from getting worse. Then they put their foot on the brake, really, and started to worry more about the budget deficit than anything else. And that is when our recovery really stalled. Meanwhile, in the rest of the world, you've had the Americans, the Brits, the Japanese continuing with big deficits, with quantitative easing, with other unconventional methods. And now they're the ones who've passed us, which makes it look relatively worse for us in Canada.
What are all these numbers, Amanda, saying about how Canadians are doing?
I feel like it adds up to a kind of a very Canadian sort of place, a kind of a very middle of the road, good enough is good enough. I take issue with the idea that we aren't better off than a year ago because we're tracking back to a surplus federally, and that matters. And our biggest trading partners are much better off than they were a year ago. So even if we're kind of sort of treading water waiting, we're in a really good position to benefit from those factors if they materialize. There are some risks around that. The U.S. could still head south. But at the moment, its economy is improving, and we benefit from that.
Patty?
Well, in terms of where we go from here, I think the most important thing is the United States, that we are seeing signs that the economy there is building momentum, and Canada can benefit from that. And we're seeing that in the export sector. For a long time, we've talked about weakness in exports. At long last, it looks like the export sector is coming back, helped by the weaker dollar and the U.S. economy. So I think there are some bright spots out there.
That still really is the case, isn't it? We go as the Americans go?
Yes, and we continue to piggyback. But the other area of that we've seen improvement as well is in productivity. A long time we've bemoaned that Canada's productivity track record is so dismal. Now we're seeing some improvement in productivity. Again, it's a good news, bad news story. Productivity is up, but what it means is we're producing more with less people, and that's reflected in the job numbers.
Okay, let me break this down in a couple of areas. Where are we successful? Where are things actually going right? Jim?
Well, one place we're getting some, and don't fall off your chair with this, Peter. Well, oh, no, you have to stand anyway. So,
we're so glad we brought you back.
Manufacturing, so long during the 2000s, was a negative story in Canada. Now it's not turned around in the sense of big new jobs numbers, but sales are up, factories are much busier, productivity is up, as Patty said, and our exports are really strong. Most of that new growth in exports that we've been talking about is coming from the manufacturing sector, not from resources, and it's coming from central Canada. So in terms of who's exposed the most to the U.S. recovery, that is one sector where we're starting to see some turnaround, and that's a hopeful sign.
Preet, areas of success.
Yeah, I was going to also say with exports, and it's not just one sector that's been doing the heavy lifting. It's been a broad-based recovery across the board. And of course, with the U.S. doing well, they say that when they sneeze, we catch a cold. Vice versa is if they're humming along, then potentially we could be singing.
Yeah.
Patty, where are we doing well?
I think it's a regional story again, Peter, because we look at the unemployment rate in Alberta, it's 4.7%. In Saskatchewan, it's 4.2%. My stepson is a welder. He lives in Ontario. He's not working in Ontario. He's working in Saskatchewan. So there's a real regional story as well.
I would look to a couple of things. I mean, to your point, we're still very reliant on that U.S. market. We've had a government very focused on trade, and we've had real success there. I mean, the European trade agreement, assuming it does get ratified, is a big deal for Canada and Canadian businesses. We've got South Korea. There's an agreement with China. All of that is a big opening them up. And I would also say our fiscal discipline, that idea that we all kind of bought in the 90s, that we shouldn't live on borrowed time. And we're, federally at least, not provincially, but federally at least, Canadians believe it and we live it, and that's not a bad thing. It actually puts us in pretty good position.
When we talk about this impact the Americans have on our economy, it always tends to be that when things are going well in Canada, the perception is, we don't really need the Americans.
Right.
And when things are questionable or going poorly, we say, oh, it's all because of what's happening in the States. Jim, where's the government's focus at all this?
Well, the focus has been very much on the deficit, as Amanda was just saying, and we are going to hear nonstop over the next year. Canada balanced the books, the first in the G7, and more of a sort of self-congratulatory rhetoric. From the economic perspective, Peter, it means nothing. There isn't a single business in Canada that is going to wake up the morning after the budget was balanced and say, whew, the deficit is gone, I'm now going to hire. That isn't how hiring works. They will hire people if they think they have a market to sell their product to. And this rush to be the first G7 country to eliminate the deficit has actually made that worse. Remember, Ottawa has eliminated 50,000 jobs in the federal public administration. That's 50,000 good jobs. So that's part of the reason our labor market's in such bad shape. So we're going to hear a lot about it. That has been their focus, but I actually think it's done a bit more harm than good.
You know, Jim's always been in favor of deficits for job creation and other things.
And lots of spending. He likes spending.
And lots of spending. But is he right when he says that no businesses wake up the morning after a budget and say, oh, well, here we go?
Well, of course I disagree with that. I think the surplus is the right thing because I think we're now in the transition phase for the Canadian economy, but I think we should be very proud that we are the first G7 to be in budgetary surplus. And what that means is a tax cut for middle-class Canadians, and they're going to spend that, and that will cause businesses to hire, and this will, I think, give a lot more momentum to the recovery. One thing that's being talked about, though, in terms of policy, is raising the minimum wage as a way to improve the lot of people with stagnant wages in the middle class. I don't agree with that. There's a rule in economics that when you raise the price, you reduce demand. And there's no proof, I think, that raising the minimum wage will create jobs. I think the better way is to cut taxes.
Let's take it away from government for a second. Tell me what the average Canadian should be focusing on at a time like this, and when we're seeing all these different numbers, different values being placed on whether they're good or bad. Preet, what should the average Canadian be thinking about?
Their personal economy, and it doesn't matter if it's bad times, mediocre, or great times. The only job you care about is your job, and there's no law that says you can't lose a job when things are going well. And I know a lot of people will say, well, we're stretched, right? We can't make ends meet. And you know what, that's probably true for some families, but I think there are a lot more families where they're simply not willing to make the trade-offs that they need to. And I can almost guarantee that 9 times out of 10, I can find a family with the same income earners, ages of children, cats, dogs, you name it, that are making less money and who aren't living paycheck to paycheck. So some people are just not willing to make the trade-offs that they need to make.
You know, there was just a recent study by, I forget the organization, but one of those on that very point. You know, how many Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck? 50%.
Right. The Canadian Payroll Association.
Exactly.
Just to be fair, they track it very closely.
What about you? What's your answer on
I would agree with that. I would agree that your own finances not being in over your head, having a sense of personal security and that your family is secure is the most important thing. But I think bigger picture, there's something else you can do, and that is not buy all the gloom and doom. We can care deeply about this stuff, and we can, Jim and I can argue till the cows come home about should we be in deficit or surplus and should we be stimulating the economy. But at the end of the day, look around your dining room table, your kitchen table, and say, how am I doing? How are we feeling? Is everybody okay? And make that your gauge, not, you know, what you heard on the National. Because in the end, that's the thing that's going to matter. And we don't want kind of a spirit of negativity to infect consumers. That's actually a really bad, vicious cycle.
Days are getting shorter. Cows are coming home earlier. You know that. Patty, where should Canadians be focused?
I think they should very much be focused on their own situation. I tend to agree with Preet there. But on a broader basis, Peter, I think it's very disappointing for people in terms of the stagnation of income. That the debate right now is we need to do something about this, we need to do something about the labour market challenges, but where are the solutions? So I agree that you have to maintain an optimism, but I think that people are getting really tired of having this, not having this debate and coming down with solutions.
Got to take a break, but Jim, where do you sit on this?
I think it comes back to the jobs issue that we were opening the show with. One reason 50% of Canadians live paycheck to paycheck is something close to 50% of Canadians are in a job that has some precarious dimensions. Part-time, it's contract, temporary, they got it through an agency. Those people can't earn enough to get beyond that paycheck to paycheck treadmill. So in order to realistically lift the confidence levels of Canadian families, and I agree how important and beneficial that would be, we've somehow got to be transforming the labour market and get more good jobs out of it.
All right. Well, as I said, we got to take a quick break. But when we come back, the big question, champ or chump? Where do we really stand these days on the international bragging meter? Welcome back to The Bottom Line. Patty, Jim, Preet, and Amanda all at the table tonight. So, champ or chump, which are we?
Absolutely champ. I think that, yes, we have our challenges in Canada, but we are well positioned in terms of the fiscal outlook. We have a budget surplus coming, and we're going to have a tax cut for middle-class Canadians. That's not happening anywhere else in the world.
Were you in the audience at the Prime Minister's speech? Jim?
We never were a champ, Peter. That was always more about politics than economics, and we aren't the basket case of the universe today either. We should stop worrying about the bragging and start focusing on putting people back to work.
So we're what, in the middle somewhere?
In the middle. We never were at the top.
Great.
Okay, you'll pardon my impersonation, but we could have been a contender. We could have been somebody. And I say that because the debt fuel...
okay.
Who was that?
Marlon Brando on the waterfront.
That was about
The
a
Indian movie,
6.2.
the Bollywood version.
Right.
The debt-fueled consumer has maybe saved the bacon for the economy over the last 5 years, but they're kind of tapped out. And I wonder if they might serve as a headwind for the next 5 years.
I'm going to go with both Patty and Jim. Champ, because in this country, nobody gets left behind. Healthcare, education, even to be poor here, it's the best place in the world to live. Don't shake your head, Jim, that's true. Chumpish, because we really do have all the promise in the world. We should be beating everybody. We have every advantage. I think of us like that high school athlete that had all that promise and now is kind of this middle-aged guy on the sofa. Get up off the sofa, Canada. It's time to get in the game again.
All right. Each of you went somewhere this summer, outside of the country. You all had a little bit of travel. So here's the bonus question tonight. What did you learn? Give me one thing that you learned about the management of the economy or whatever it might be on those international trips.
I went to Iceland. I absolutely loved it. And what I learned is it's okay to believe in elves and trolls when you live in a place with such magical scenery.
And it is magical, isn't it?
It is magical.
Jim, trolls, elves?
Well, I was down in Australia, all right, mate? And that's a champ to chump story. That was the one country that avoided the recession altogether in 2009. But now they've been so fixated on the so-called fundamentals, very rapid deficit reduction, and then where the manufacturing sector's in trouble, the government just washed their hands of it. So their auto industry is going to disappear completely next year. They're in much worse state now than they were at the time of the recession. I think it's cautionary for us to don't put our ideology ahead of the reality.
Didn't know they had Australian-made
They
cars.
did.
Okay.
Not for long, though.
Preet.
I went to Peru, but pretty much anywhere around the world, what you'll notice is that houses are a lot smaller than the houses that we have in North America. And commensurately, people have a lot less junk in their homes around the world. And so for the personal finance advice, if you get a smaller home, then the double benefit is you pay less for the house and you have less space to put your junk into.
Amanda.
Well, I spent some time in a part of the U.S. that is sort of an enclave of the wealthy, visiting there as a tourist. And I'll tell you that one thing I noticed is that the wealth disparity is extreme and that there's a bit of a bubble effect. And so the thing that I took away from that is that wealth is fine, it's aspirational, it's wonderful. If you're among the upper wealthy class, remember not to get into a bubble. And in Canada, we can avoid that. And I think probably that's the most important message I took.
All right, interesting observations and obviously great analysis through this discussion. Thank you all. Look forward to seeing you again in 4 weeks' time. And as usual, we always welcome your ideas for focused topics. You can find us at cbcnews.ca/thenational.